Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video. Today it is the 16th of May. In today's upload, we're looking at numerous notable Russian advances. The most important one being the capture of Myrolyubivka by the Russian side east of Murad on the Pokrovsk front. We're going to look at the details surrounding that capture and the topography east of the city of Murad. We're also going to discuss the negotiations between Russia and Ukraine that unfolded in Turkey. We're going to look at the contents of the discussion and the potential agreements. There are very few, but potential agreements that both sides could come to an understanding on moving forward. I also want to discuss a shakeup in the Russian military command ahead of the summer military campaign that we've been discussing a lot on this channel recently. We're seeing that a lot of notable shuffles in the command have commenced over the past couple of days, and so I'll give specifics on that later on in the video. Let's begin with Velika Novosilka. You can see that the Russians captured the western portion of Vilna Pole, amounting to zero point 0.7 square kilometers. We have a video over here from the 5th Combined Arms Army where they raised their flag, and Russian sources report that they were able to clear out 230 houses in the settlement and destroyed a company-sized formation, according to their claims. And you can see as a result that the Russians have access to this paved road leading directly northwards to Shevchenko. This village is the largest one that remains under Ukrainian control in this entire sector, in between the three oblasts, being over here Donetsk to the west, Dnipro, and to the south, Zaporozhye. There are no other villages of a similar size, the closest one being Zelenopole, which is also really close to falling into the Russian line of contact, Russian control. It's only about 2 kilometers away from where the Russians are currently at. A big issue with the fall of Shevchenko would be the fact that the Russians would then have direct access to this trench line that the Ukrainians invested so many resources into building up over the past couple of years. This trench line that is supposed to defend against attacks coming from the south and runs from the Mokryali River area and even further eastwards. But at this point, the eastern chunks are largely under Russian control. And then to the west, they extend it to Dnipro and then make this inroad southwards into Zaporozhye, acting as the second or third line, depending on your interpretation, within the Zaporozhye region. And it is pretty deep, pretty far away from the line of contact. It's about 10 kilometers away. So it is a really important line. And the fact that the Russians are already infiltrating it from a certain location means that the Ukrainians really weren't prepared for that possibility looking back a couple of months. They were banking on Velika Novosilka acting as a staging point and defense hub to prevent any sort of deep Russian infiltrations. But with the fall of that city in late January, the Russians have had access to new attack vectors pushing northwards and therefore have been able to really make it more conducive to attack towards these trenches. And there are also gaps in the line, gaps in between trenches that the Russians can now exploit. You have this large span of open fields west of Shevchenko all the way to Kamyshyuvacha. It spans about 6 kilometers, and then you arrive at the border between Donetsk and Dnipro. And this is an area that's sort of in between the trench line to the south and the one to the north that the Russians are pretty close to reaching. And you could see over here how the Russians could potentially create a wedge and flank both of them from opposing directions. So that's a grave concern for the Ukrainians because they have not yet prepared the physical infrastructure, or should say the manpower necessary to hold on to these trenches. The actual physical excavators that were used to build the dugouts, anti-tank ditches, dragon's teeth, that's all in place, although it could always be further refined, not at this point anymore because the Russians are so close. But the manpower that's been needed to deploy and to hold on to these trenches has not yet made it because they're focused on other parts of the front line. They're focused on areas that are less deep into the Ukrainian rear. So the fact that the Russians are already arriving at these backup lines is definitely a concern. Looking at the situation around Bakhatir, the Ukrainian forces claim they conducted a counterattack led by the 33rd Mechanized Brigade and that they've been able to clear out 95% of the village, meaning there is a small sliver of Russian control in the southeastern corner where you have some troops sort of just resisting in dugouts and basements. That's what Deep State is claiming. I don't know if that's true, but I do know that the Ukrainians reported that there was a Russian infiltration attempt today using 10 infantry and 4 motorcyclists with 2 on each motorcycle. And the Ukrainians claim they were able to kill all 14 of those infiltrators. So for the time being, we don't have any additional proof of deeper Russian advances. So I'm maintaining the same front line, but there is certainly a possibility of a Ukrainian counterattack because look at the bigger picture. The Ukrainians don't have anywhere else nearby to withdraw to. There aren't any comparable defensive nodes or villages at a large Ukrainian garrison that you can see over here on the map. You could see all these units over here deployed. They don't have anywhere else to go that would be of enough surface area and inviting enough for such a large garrison to resist in. And they do need to retain control over this defense line, spanning from Bakhatir to the south all the way up northwards to Bogdanivka, and the Russian advances into Bakhatir inherently threaten that. So I would not be surprised if the Ukrainians are conducting counterattacks over here and would be able to invest enough resources to temporarily stabilize and actually retake some land. So that's always a possibility. But when you look at it, the capture of Bakhatir and by extension Oleksivka would then give the Russians an open route to attack westwards to Kamar. There would be just numerous open fields in between and no means for the Ukrainians to resist. And then running along this highway, they would have direct access to the Vavta River Valley and the border with Dnipro, giving them another area through which to enter into the oblast, and then from there reach the southern outskirts of Novopavlivka. So yes, there are a lot of reasons why the Ukrainians would prefer to ensure that the line of contact remains steady along this defense line, even if it means further attrition for their forces over here. You can also see the Russians advance 2.5 square kilometers north of this Ukrainian salient. The salient itself is unique because it's not based around any Ukrainian fortresses that were built. There are no permanent obstacles. There are no settlements around here. There are just small Ukrainian squads that are putting themselves in an extremely compromised position, but nonetheless are resistant to movements westwards because they want to use this buffer zone as a distraction and a physical separation between the current line of contact and the Russian firepower concentrations and attacks. They want to ensure that it stays away as far as possible from the northern flank of Oleksivka, for instance, and then by extension also the border between Donetsk and Dnipro, where you do have this really long span of anti-tank ditches in Dragon's Teeth, and then from there you just have a large chunk of open fields that are completely undefended areas that would be really exposed if the Russians were to infiltrate past them. So definitely, that's the reason why the Ukrainians continue resisting over here. But we do have a video from the 35th Brigade. So this unit is deployed over here and is involved in a lot of the defensive activity. They struck Russian soldier in a ditch, so he was able to enter into this ditch that was built by the Ukrainians, really wide ditch just south of Bogdanivka, indicating that there are some Russian inroads around here. But where the Russians have actually been able to achieve a really sizable gain is in Novoserhivka and south of it. So the Russians were able to push directly through the Solna River Valley into Novoserhivka, and we do have the proof of that. So this video is from May 11th, so it's actually a couple days old now. But the Ukrainians, they shelled 3 Russian vehicles as they were advancing along this vector and were actually approaching Novomikhailovka, meaning that you have the Russians reaching very close to the border with Dnipro from another location even. And by extension, the Russians were able to create this very compromised salient, similar to the salient that we just talked about further south. But in this case, the Ukrainians just lacked the infrastructure or the momentum to halt the Russian advances. And there was a worry of whatever small squads, groupings of like 4 or 5 each, having the ability to retain control over here. There was a worry that they wouldn't be able to and that they would be encircled. And so the Ukrainians had no other choice but to withdraw, and the units involved come from the 59th Assault Brigade. They're the main element that's trying to resist. They resisted really well in Uspanivka, but since then they have been unable to conduct stabilization measures in nearby villages, meaning that they do need support. 11th National Guard Brigade is also around here, but I don't know how active they are or whether they're up to the task, whether their quality is sufficient for that matter. So this is seriously an area the Ukrainians do need to fortify better. There is a large concentration of Ukrainian forces spanning from Rudachne to Zhvirove to this entire region in order to first stabilize and then conduct local counterattacks. So it would not be too far-fetched to see one of those units redeployed a bit to the south to prevent the Russians from continuing with their momentum over here and galvanizing upon it to reach the border with Dnipro and crossing it. Because once the Russians begin to cross, then they'll take advantage of that. They'll capitalize on those areas, and then it will be really no turning back. The Ukrainians will have an extremely difficult time changing the situation. And then the Dnipro will also be a part of the Russian purview for future offensives. So really, this advance is notable. It amounts to 18 square kilometers. That is insane for relative terms. Relatively speaking, it's a lot for this part of the front line. You could see over here, May 15th, the 59th Brigade's FDVs, they hit Russian armored vehicles, motorcycles, and infantry as they were roaming around these open fields that advanced a really sizable distance amounting to 3.5 kilometers westwards. And that means that at least the Russians are 1.8 kilometers away. I'd say at most, if we're measuring it, it's at 7 kilometers. So definitely keep an eye for this part of the front line because the Russians have now created a rather solid line, and there are these open fields in between Muravka and Novomykhailovka that really are not well defended. What is well defended is the border with Dnipro due to the river and due to the trenches. But arriving there is a totally different story and is definitely possible right now. Now, to move on to the Pokrovsk front, this is what I wanted to talk about in particular. We have over here the full capture of Myrolyubivka, which is a complicated settlement. It's not a walk in the park when it comes to capturing it. So the fact that the Russians were able to do it in pretty quick succession does speak favorably to the grouping over here, the Russian grouping of forces in this location. We can see that the Russians captured at least 1.8 square kilometers of territory and were even able to cross past the Kazani Touretsk River. Not that it is that notable over here. It is basically just a floodplain with a very narrow body of water. But nonetheless, the Russians were able to cross over and raise their flags in multiple locations in northern Myrolyubivka. So now the entirety of this town is under their control, and by extension, the Russians have access to this paved road that pushes northwards into Mykolaievka, so they can arrive at that village and then from there also arrive at the T0504 highway, this very important highway that then bisects Mirnorod and Pokrovsk. And a lot of these advances are now getting connected to the Malinivka advance. What we're seeing is a two-pronged attack. You could see how the Russians initially crossed over, passed over Touretsk, across the Touretsk River, took over Myrolyubivka after a couple of weeks of back and forth. And in tandem, they're currently pushing along the T0504 and have taken over most of Malinivka. So we have over here this yellow polygon indicating a 1 square kilometer advance, and the geolocation from May 14th shows the 14th National Guard Brigade with their FTVs striking vehicles and motorcycles along with houses in the western chunk of the village. With these two prongs simultaneously, blossoming, you could say, the Ukrainian garrison that's sandwiched in between and extends all the way southeastwards into Yelizavetivka is an extreme danger. The fact that they have not decided yet to withdraw indicates that they're trying to drag out the fighting over here for as long as possible and prevent the Russian attention from becoming unified and uniform, focusing on a singular part of the front line that is much closer to the heart of Murad. So that's why the Ukrainians are still trying to, shift Russian focus away as much as possible by continuing to resist in Yelizavetivka, even if the escape route by now is very dangerous. You could see that they would have to leave a 7 kilometer salient in order to do so. It's obviously possible, but there are no paved roads over here. It would just be completely through open areas. Very dangerous. So we could see how the direction of the advances currently indicates that the Russians are looking to take over Mirny and thereby connect with the Myrolyubivka garrison and then just completely get rid of this Yelizavetivka salient, which would give the Russians control over a really important hill because the Ukrainians in this red zigzag area, they are located on a ridge that overlooks the Touretsk River Valley. That river valley is partially under Russian control. That includes areas like Khodivka all the way up to the pond over here. But then you look at Mykolaievka, Novo Ekono, Michny, and further northwards, Razini, and a bunch of other villages over here. They're all running along the same low-lying depression. But the difference is that the Ukrainians tend to have control over the ridges on either side of the river valley. So now it's obviously up to the Russians to try to change that status quo. Their objective will be to take over the key heights that overlook certain locations defending the eastern approaches into the Munirhad Pokrovsk agglomeration. That includes the area over here, but it also includes this area that I'm circling over here with this very large perimeter. It's an area that largely is in an open field north of the T0504. It also extends into Kopjive and a couple of other villages, and there are not many trenches over here. So the Russians do have an opportunity to expand control into this area, and that would give them a very good vantage point to begin crossing over some of the fortified areas over here. I would say most notably Razine. This seems like a weak point in the Ukrainian line. It's not too close to Murad, and it's also just on very low elevation, so it would be compromised. And it would also give the Russians access to this slack heap over here, this very important terracon that would give a localized advantage and points through which to surveil the entirety of Murad. So obviously keep that in mind as a potential attack vector. And also more generally, it could connect to the advances that are occurring near Novoolonivka. So you do have over here a really large height. I'm marking it in red for you guys. That is directly to the northwest of the T0504. And the Russians are already making inroads towards arriving at this height. You could see that they captured over the past 2 days nearly 6 square kilometers of territory, largely open fields, but also a couple of dugouts and trenches along really difficult terrain. These are really rugged areas on high elevation. And now, as a result, the Russians do have the opportunity to completely cut off the highway over here, advance past it, and then also overrun Novopoltavka because it is relatively isolated from the rest of the Ukrainian garrison, which is further northwards around Popiev Yar, Poltavka, and Rusin Yar. But just in general, this part of the front line is pretty scant when it comes to manpower. You can see how there is this pretty large gap in between the Konstantinivka line, which is about over here, and then this line of villages that runs all the way up to Druskivka. So this region over here that's in between, it is largely exposed besides the fact that there are two lines of trenches, and it also is largely on open fields, largely in an open area. So it could be an area that the Russians could exploit in order to get proper standing before they sort of try to flank Pokrovsk from the north, because that's what I see happening right now. I think the Russians are not going to try to directly enter into Pokrovsk. They're going to try to maneuver around it, try to infiltrate through one of the trench lines over here, and perhaps arrive at an area that allows them to cut off both through fire control initially and then physically the northernmost highway into the city. I believe that's the plan right now. So definitely keep an eye for that during the summer campaign. Also, looking at the Kostiantinivka direction, as I refer to it, we do still have the same situation. There's not any concrete proof of the Ukrainians unilaterally withdrawing from these two pockets. To be fair to the Ukrainians, the salients are on high elevation compared to the Russian advance vectors. But with that being said, the fact they're still resisting over here is insane. When you think of the fact that it's extremely deep, you could see over here, this one is about 8 kilometers deep, and then the other one is at most 12 kilometers or 11 and a half kilometers deep. The effort that it would take to move even a small amount of forces from the northern tip or southern tip rather to the northern tip and escape without paved roads, without much of fire support. It's difficult to move FPVs into this area when the Russians have their own crews circling around the entire perimeter and doing so without much artillery support either from a Ukrainian perspective. It's extremely difficult for them to organize a sort of evacuation, and especially without cars or anything of the sorts. So they're going to have to do it on foot, and they will be spotted by at least some Russian drone crews, like the Rubicon drone units, which is highly experienced from the Kursk days, and now they're involved in activities over here. So, with all that being said, the Ukrainians continue to try to drag out fighting over here because it really acts as a distraction. It stretches the front line, meaning that you need to have additional Russian troops manning every single inch of this entire stretched out crest perimeter, which is advantageous for the Ukrainians because they're not really investing a lot of their own men into these salients. They're just trying to use the bare minimum, scraping the barrel for as long as possible in these areas while they try to build up in Yablonivka and further northwards in Konstantinivka. But obviously, just due to the dynamics of how deep the salients are, it's not sustainable. So are the escape routes. They're very narrow, meaning that the Ukrainians will have an impetus to eventually leave. And that will also give the Russians an opportunity to consolidate control over an extremely large chunk of territory in record time. Honestly, it would be one of the largest Russian advances up to date in a certain time frame when we look at the context of the Russian advances since the August period of 2024, when we really saw an intensification of fighting all around Donetsk. Also, we could see how it would give the Russians a proper base to begin attacking towards the city of Konstantinivka from the southwest along this highway over here. If we're looking at the higher elevated areas, they would be sort of like largely north of the highway over here. This is where you have the most heights, this area here. So this could definitely be a Russian target. But then you look at the city itself, and it is on a really low elevation. And same goes for all of the entrances into it, along highways and along populated chains of villages. So from a Ukrainian perspective, they do have some areas that act as backup in terms of higher elevation, but a lot of them are currently within the Russian purview, and it would be in the Russians' best interest to try to take them over first before assaulting the city head on. In Chasiv Yar, we can see over here that the Russians captured what amounts to nearly 27 hectares. So we have reporting from the Ukrainian side that the Russians are located in most of the citadel. Russian sources also confirm this, although they say that there is still some Ukrainian activity along this southern tip. There are, 10 houses perhaps that still remain under Ukrainian control. So now the focus is on fully clearing those ones out. But you can see how other houses in this yellow polygon have been consolidated. A lot of forested areas, apartment buildings, and such taken over by the Russian side. So now the goal will be to fully clear out the citadel and then shift focus towards Shevchenko, this micro district south of Chasiv Yar. And there are also reports of the Russians intensifying offensive activity towards the town of Stupochki to the south, which acts as a really important sort of intermediary point between the line of contact and then villages like Pritichny, because once you look at it, Pritichny is the only village on the road before arriving at Kostyantynivka. And the city itself obviously has solid defenses when it comes to its perimeter and its entrances. But in between the line of contact and the defensive perimeter, there simply are not enough man built obstacles. There are geographic obstacles, obviously. There's very rugged terrain. There are quarries over here. There are forested areas or ponds. It also works both ways because it means that it's difficult for the Ukrainians to move in and out of these areas. They get pinned down in a lot of cases, but also it makes it difficult for the Russians to advance to a certain degree. With that being said, there are not enough trenches in these areas, meaning the Russians will be able to take advantage of it and arrive. Once they obviously clear out populated areas, they'll be able to cross through the open fields at a faster pace. So that's a concern with the Chasiv Yar region looking forward, and we'll see how the Ukrainians respond to that threat. Finally, with Torska, we have over here a video of the Russians raising their flag in Torska on May 15th. Deep State claimed that it was just a transient matter in that the Russian garrison got pushed back, and they also took 5 POWs from this assault group. They also took a photo of those POWs, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the Russians are no longer in control of this yellow polygon. Until I get some sort of proof to the contrary, I'm going to maintain that the Russians are in control of an additional zero point 0.8 square kilometers of territory that is directly east of Zarichny and also is basically at the center of Torska. There still are many houses in the southern tip of the village that have to be taken over by the Russian side. And so that will be obviously a big focus of the Russians moving forward. But you can see how a lot of the salients that were previously located over here have been fully leveled off. And now the Russians have a very solid line of contact with a lot of forward operating bases to move southwards and fully clear out the Zherebets bridgehead, which is obviously a huge objective and really necessary in order to move forward past that and look at areas like Liman. Okay, now when it comes to the negotiations, we know that the talks lasted less than 2 hours between the Russian and Ukrainian side alike, but both Turkish and Ukrainian officials that were present at the Istanbul talks said that they were not able to achieve that much headway when it came to the most important matters. Obviously, the Ukrainian position that Zelensky has made very clear is that they would prefer to have a 30-day ceasefire, and after that, they would begin the technical discussion on, foreign participation, activity in NATO, EU, ceding certain territories to the Russian side. But first, they want to have a 30-day ceasefire period without any conditions, and that's an issue for the Russian side because the Russians interpret that as being a sort of a vessel for the Ukrainians to rearm without any military pressure during that time period in case the peace talks would eventually collapse. So that's sort of the dynamic going into the negotiations. The biggest success of the talks, though, and again, we're talking about very short discussions, like in less than 2 hours is not enough to really get into details or rehash anything. It's only enough for like an initial rapport building session. But despite that fact, both sides did agree to a 1,000 for 1,000 POW swap. So, the Ukrainians will receive 1,000 of their soldiers back that are alive, and likewise for Russia. This is obviously going to be something that hits harder for Ukraine because they have, as an absolute number, less Russian troops POW than the obviously the Ukrainian side does. So the Ukrainians will have less, I suppose, cards or less bargaining chips in the future moving forward because of this 1,000 for 1,000 swap. They won't have as many live Russians in the future that can be used in these sort of trades because they're trading the same amount. But it is still important because they're getting back 1,000 of their soldiers, and many of those soldiers probably have an ideological commitment to going back to fighting as well. So they can be used as manpower moving forward in case there aren't any peace talks. And I believe that this will probably be one of several of these prisoner swaps because probably the easiest thing to conduct that doesn't change the status quo that much, but does still sort of show a willingness for foreign actors and for the public as a whole that there is sort of like a mood for negotiations is a prisoner deal. Both sides are, more responsive to that. And that's why every month there have been prisoner swaps of bodies, of dead bodies for either side. So actually today there was a swap wherein the Russians received 34 dead Russian soldiers and the Ukrainians received 909 soldiers. So that's an insane ratio when you think about it. It's almost 27 to 1. And the number of dead Ukrainians being received on a monthly basis is capped off at 909. The Ukrainians are no longer accepting any more than that because they don't. I would assume the reason why is because they don't have enough Russian bodies to give the Ukrainians, or rather, enough Russian bodies to give back to the Russians that would not make their stockpile extremely small because the Ukrainians need to ensure they do still have a stockpile of uh, Russian bodies that can be used as bargaining chips for long term. So that's why they're rationing it, and that's why they're only giving between 50 to 30 on a monthly basis. It's also because they have less than the Russians. Obviously, there's no way that they don't with that 27 to 1 ratio. The only reason the Russians are willing to accept those sort of ratios is because they know the Ukrainians don't have that many bodies. But nonetheless, that does show you guys the mismatch when it comes to the amount of bodies retrieved by either side, which is partially due to attrition rates and is also partially due to the fact that the Russians are largely the force that is on the offensive. Now, moving on, there were a couple of other really important points that came out of the negotiations. First of all, there was a rejection of U.S. mediation. So the talks will be, for the time being, directly between Ukraine and Russia and their respective delegations. And we all talked about how the Russian delegation was considered a bit, or not even a bit, but it was considered less prestigious when it comes to the people that were sent to discuss the talks. Because, the Ukrainians brought in the defense ministers, foreign ministers, really high ranking officials. Zelensky was in the country and had a meeting with Erdogan and Rubio. So that was really important at the time. But Putin did not arrive. Lavrov did not arrive. Instead, Medinsky led the coalition for the Russian side, and he's a really important aide for Putin, and he was involved in the 2022 Istanbul talks. So it's not like he's a stranger to these discussions, and he's very smart on a technical level. So that's why he was delegated for the task. But, besides that, it was all deputies, like deputy foreign minister, deputies in, intelligence agencies and technical teams with, less stature when you look at the grand scheme of things. So it does show a level, a less willingness to take the term seriously at first. That's why Putin was not involved at first. But what Medinsky did say is that he will take to heart the request of the Ukrainians to have direct meetings between the heads of states of both the Russians and the Ukrainian side, meaning that the Russians will consider the possibility of Putin meeting with Zelensky at some point on in the future, but not in the first opening salvo of talks. Additionally, both sides agreed that they should write down a formal list of the conditions needed for a ceasefire. So they didn't actually say what those conditions are, but they said that they'd write it for each other in order to, be on the same page in the next round of discussions. And they did agree to have another round of talks. So that's something that's obviously not costly. Both sides can agree to talks without having like the innate willingness to go forward with it because there's no loss to continuing negotiations while the war continues for either side if they were to want to continue the war, because all it would do is show the United States perhaps that they have a willingness to continue with peace negotiations and such. So that's why these talks will continue, I believe. Whether they will materialize anything, I'm extremely skeptical, but I do believe we'll continue to see rounds of dialogue between the Russian and Ukrainian side, and there will be no U.S. involvement for the time being. Michael Anton, who's really important in terms of policy planning for the State Department, he was supposed to mediate, but the Russians rejected this proposal. The Russians also did say, in terms of like their general terms for a ceasefire, that they wanted the Ukrainians to withdraw from the entirety of the four oblasts that the Russians recognize as under their control. So that would include Kherson, where the Ukrainians control, you can see over here, 5,700 square kilometers of territory, and then another, 800 square kilometers. So you're looking at an insanely large stretch of territory. In Zaporozhye, you have over here 740 and then 5,800 square kilometers that they would have to withdraw from. And then in Donetsk, we have another, what is this? Let's see, 1,400 square kilometers. Further north, we have this chunk over here, 1,500. Here it's 4,400. And then we have further north in Luhansk, just a couple of square kilometers that remain under Ukrainian control. So those are the Russian terms in order to actually achieve a ceasefire. And that's actually pretty much the same as what the Russians were saying last year. The Russians said last year they would be open to a ceasefire under the conditions of Ukraine not joining NATO and the Ukrainians withdrawing from those four oblasts. Ukrainians said that was a non-starter and said it was an unrealistic expectation. And Medinsky said that he was, in principle, supportive of peace, but that the Russians would be willing to fight for as long as it takes. And he brought up the Great Northern War, which is actually really insane when you look at it at the years in which a war was fought. It was fought between 1700 to 1721. So you're looking at a 21-year period of fighting. And he said that the Russians were willing to, continue fighting for as long as needed, and sort of alluded to that fact that it could be really as long as it takes without any sort of time limits. So that's just sort of the intention presented by the Russians. And they said that if the Ukrainians are not responsive to their current terms, that they will consider taking over Sumy Oblast and Kharkiv Oblast. And that would include, first of all, a formal process of recognizing those two oblasts as under Russian control. And then they would be able to change the equation. And instead of there being four oblasts that the Russians have as their current war goal, they would add in these two in addition. And that would extend the course of the war by a lot when you think about it, because taking over these areas, only a small fraction of them are actually marked on my map as blue. And even this is 9,200 square kilometers. And here it's at 13,000 square kilometers. So you're looking at an extremely sizable chunk of territory, really, really deep into Ukraine itself, into the heartland of Ukraine. A lot of natural resources over here, key cities like Kharkiv, for instance. And the Russians, their change of the equation could be the fact that they'll continue adding in new territories that they will have to take over at some point in order for the war to end and in order for them to accept the ceasefire with Ukraine. So the Ukrainians, they have a choice to make politically when looking at this, because it's clear from the Russian side that they're sticking to their guns. They're sticking to the same terms and they're not really faltering on it, because the Russians believe that they currently have the initiative and can eventually achieve these gains militarily. So they don't really have to do it politically unless the Ukrainians would agree to it. And then it would just be a convenience for the Russians. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, they are hoping for some sort of reasonable degree of discussion with the Russians that would allow them to, have not maximal gains achieved, but not the gains. What I mean is that the Ukrainians have been receptive to a certain amount of wiggle room, meaning they actually aren't necessarily opposed in principle to freezing the line of contact at where it is. They haven't said directly what they believe about this and whether they would want to reclaim certain territories back, but they are leaving it out in the open as a possibility. But withdrawing from these territories, they view as a non-starter. So the Ukrainians are trying to find some sort of agreement that would be reasonable from their perspective. But at the same time, if it doesn't work, they want to frame it as them being receptive to talks and willing to achieve a peace, but Russia being the party that is interested in continuing the war. And the hope of that would be to show Europe, but in particular Trump, who the sort of the person that isn't willing to cooperate really is. And hopefully, from a Ukrainian standpoint, that would lead to more sanctions. It will lead to a renewed aid package for Ukraine coming from Europe as a unified body and also from the United States. So that's generally the hope from the Ukrainian side and the way they're approaching the negotiations. But the downside is, if the negotiations fall through and Europe or the US aren't able to really increase their share as much as the Ukrainians hope, and then the Russians actually say that they want to permanently occupy Sumy and Kharkiv, then the dynamic really changes and it would actually be worse than the current dynamic for Ukraine. So it really is a risk that they're taking politically. So we'll have to see how it materializes. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.